Our next speaker is Dr. Eric Wilson. Eric Wilson, Thomas H. Pritchard Professor of English and Director of the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies program at Wake Forest, gives us special reason to be proud. After finishing his undergraduate degree at Appalachian State University, Eric came to Wake Forest to study in our small but distinguished MA program in English. After earning his PhD with distinction at City University of New York, he took various teaching positions until in 1998 he returned to Wake Forest, where in 2006 he became Professor of English. His classes in American and British Romanticism, Romantic Philosophy, and Literary Theory, as well as special courses in Literature and Science and Literature and Ecology, have made him one of the most popular teachers in the liberal arts. Had Eric Wilson been content to make his reputation in academic lecturing and publication in his field, he would already have achieved great success. But several years ago, he also took a step in another direction, writing his own personal story for a broader audience. The immediate acclaim for his book, Against Happiness, catapulted him to national attention, setting off a wave of reviews, television and radio appearances, and invited lectureships. He followed that book with The Mercy of Eternity, a memoir of depression and grace, and that book will be available for sale at our reception. Forthcoming books, My Business is to Create, Blake's Infinite Writing, and Everyone Loves a Good Train Wreck, or Why Can't We Stop Looking at Terrible Things, are certain to add new critical attention and readers to his growing audiences. In the midst of what must have seemed to him a whirlwind of sudden celebrity status, Eric Wilson has kept his head, living quietly with his wife and daughter in Winston-Salem's West End, teaching and assuming administrative duties at Wake Forest. Eric Wilson is what in today's culture might be called a crossover artist, except those of us who know him know that he never really left teaching at Wake Forest to earn his fame with a broader audience. He just seems comfortable making literature a part of living. Today, Eric is going to talk to us about teaching poetry to today's students. Eric Wilson.
Well, last year about this time, my chair called me up and said, we're going to have an A.R. Ammons Festival, and I would like you to talk about teaching poetry in the 21st century. I thought the only way I would be capable of addressing such a topic would be through invoking endless vapid generalizations, or telling highly particular stories of what I happen to do in my classroom. I assumed that this talk would be doomed to fail. Well, then I remembered what Ammons himself once said. He said, "For though we often need to be restored to the small, concrete, limited, and certain, we as often need to be reminded of the large, vague, unlimited, unknown." So here what I'll do is I'll do my best to move back and forth between general statements about poetry, which I hope are not vapid, and telling stories about my own classroom experience, which I hope is not too particular to have any meaning. And my hope is to make a few remarks about the power of poetry in general, being led by Archie Ammons as a tutelary spirit. Now, I'll tell you at the outset, I am not a specialist in A.R. Ammons. However, I really attribute my interest in Romanticism to A.R. Ammons. When I was here at Wake Forest as a master's student back in 1990, I took a class with Dr. Jim Hands on 20th century American poetry, and we read Ammons along with Wallace Stevens in that class. I was profoundly affected by Corson's Inlet. I was profoundly affected by The Poem is a Walk. Both gave me new ways to see some of my favorite works of my other literary heroes from the Romantic age. Seeing Thoreau's Walking, for instance, through the eyes of Ammons, or William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, or even William Blake's A Mental Traveler, made those poems come to life in fresh and vital ways. I think you could say I am a romanticist via A.R. Ammons. So even though I will be talking a good bit about the Romantic poets that I adore so much, I will constantly have Archie Ammons by my side. We'll be nodding at him from time to time, and we'll conclude with some remarks from his poem, Corson's Inlet, which remains probably one of my all-time favorite poems. In A Poem is a Walk, A.R. Ammons says that a poem is like a walk. And here is how that is so. I would suggest that you teach poetry that leads us to the unstructured sources of our being, just as a walk leads us to the unstructured sources of our being, to the unknown, and returns us to our rational, structured selves refreshed. Having once experienced the mystery, plenitude, contradiction, and composure of a work of art, we afterward have built-in resistance to the slogans and propaganda of oversimplification that have often contributed to the destruction of human life. Poetry is a verbal means to a nonverbal source. It is a motion to no motion, to the still point of contemplation and deep realization. Its knowledges are all negative and therefore more positive than any knowledge. Nothing that can be said about it in words is worth saying. I want to take a walk today through some of the most powerful statements on the nature of poetry and the history of poetry. And also I'm going to meander a bit to the everyday happenings in my classroom. And the goal is to think about what poetry can teach students, can teach all of us, now in the 21st century, an age that seems most unpoetic. Let's begin with a walk and a dead dogfish. Walker Percy, one of the great Southern novelists, was also quite a philosopher. And in one of his books on language, he has this sublime little essay called Loss of Creature. And it really is about how education today alienates us from concrete particulars. Here's what he says. A young Falkland Islander walking along a beach and spying a dead dogfish and going to great work on it with his jackknife has, in a fashion wholly unprovided in modern educational theory, a great advantage over the Scarsdale High School pupil who finds the dogfish on his laboratory desk. Similarly, the citizen in Huxley's Brave New World who stumbles across a volume of Shakespeare in some vine-grown ruins and squats on a potsherd to read it is in a fairer way of getting at the sonnet than a Harvard sophomore taking English poetry too. Unless Professor Wimler is teaching it, obviously, right? An educator whose business it is to teach students biology or poetry is unaware of a whole ensemble of relations which exist between the student and the dogfish, and between the student and the Shakespeare sonnet. To put it bluntly, a student who has the desire to get at a dogfish or a Shakespeare sonnet may have the greatest difficulty in salvaging the creature itself from the educational package in which it is presented. The great difficulty is that he is not aware that there is a difficulty. Surely, he thinks, in such a fine classroom, with such a fine textbook, the sonnet must come across. What's wrong with me? This is the loss of creature. And I would submit that in our virtual age, our creatures are further away from us than probably Percy's were back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Percy asks us to imagine an example of how we lose creature, not only in our classrooms, but even in our vacations, our tourism. How many of us have grown up looking at pictures of the Grand Canyon? And then when we go to the Grand Canyon, what are we doing? Comparing the Grand Canyon to the pictures of the Grand Canyon. Percy says this is an example of how when we are so inundated by media images, we often tend to see actual events as examples of sort of media abstractions floating around in our head. Well, this is a very powerful idea that's been explored by many of our great 20th century thinkers. You might think of Walter Benjamin's great essay on mechanical reproduction, saying that once works of art can be reproduced mechanically, they often lose their aura, right? So you spend your whole life looking at pictures of Mona Lisa. You see pictures of Mona Lisa on T-shirts, on coffee mugs, on television sets. And then when you suddenly go see the picture of Mona Lisa, the aura has been removed. It's become flattened. It's seen as just one more example of these downloaded abstractions, right? One could say that our inundation of media images, our total addiction to the virtual world of the computer, has moved us even further away from the real than a postcard of the Grand Canyon or a copy of Mona Lisa. I know for myself that when I sit and try to read, I really have to turn my computer off because I'm constantly waiting for that little bell to ring telling me I have a new email. Or I'm constantly checking it to see, oh, what's the temperature now? Oh, have there been any breaks in the headlines? It's totally altered my relationship to time. I'm constantly expecting a new little media hit, something that will break the tedium of my life. I've developed a kind of a version of attention deficit syndrome. And I can only imagine my students. It's almost as if for my students, if information is not packaged in some sort of technological form, it doesn't count, right? If it's not Twittered, if it's not emailed, it doesn't really exist in a certain way. So I think that we're in a world where our students are overcome by the virtual at the loss of the actual. And I think also we're in a world where we're so inundated by information that it's hard to achieve what people once called wisdom, right? So what I hope to achieve in my classrooms, and what I think poetry can do, is it can break through the virtual with the actual, and it can short-circuit the information and open us to wisdom. I think one big problem we face is what William Wordsworth in his preface to Lyrical Ballads calls the savage torpor that is caused by being overstimulated by too many images, too many sounds, too many sights. How can we feel again? This is Wordsworth's question. This is Archie Ammons' question. This is the question that we will ask today. How can poetry break through and reattach us to the real? Poetry, I'm generalizing insanely, I realize, right? Poetry opens us to the infinity of particularity. What does that mean? William Blake says that one of the great problems of life is that we are fixated on ratio. What does he mean by ratio? For William Blake, ratio is a sort of lowest common denominator of sense perception. If I put a picture of the sun up there on the board, and I asked each of you to write a description of that sun, and then afterward I collated all those responses and found maybe 5 or 6 commonalities among them, we could all agree that that's what the sun is, right? William Blake says when most people look at the sun, they see a huge coin in the sky. This is ratio, the lowest common denominator of perception. What do I see? Angels crying, holy, 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 Lord, high almighty. Who's right? Right? So ratio is in a way our own personal history of abstractions that divorce us from particular beings. How many robins have you seen in your life? 5, 50, 1,000, 1,000,000? What happens? Over time, your mind just automatically draws from those particular little red and black feathered things this sort of abstract, wispy image of robinness. You have it in your head right now, don't you? Kind of abstract, wispy robinness, right? So what do? When you see an actual kind of black and white feathered thing, you try to fit it into that preconceived abstraction. And therefore, according to Blake, you're just really living retrospectively. And moreover, you're living narcissistically, because basically you're just seeing the world as a reflection of your own history of perception. For Blake, ratio leads us into the dull round. We have the same experience over and over and over and over again. Now, we can't escape ratio, obviously. We have to use abstraction when we think. But can other works of art somehow break into those ratios, shatter those abstractions, and open us to the immediate, the fresh, and the new? William Blake thinks so, right? He says in one of his annotations to the artist Reynolds, to generalize is to be an idiot. To particularize alone is distinction of merit. General knowledge is the knowledge that idiots possess. Elsewhere he says minute description. That is the sole basis of the sublime. He says that true innocence is to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Now, when we start talking about breaking through the ratio and opening up to the infinite complexity of the world, we can get mystical right quick, right? We can start thinking about ideas of spirit or soul. But I think Blake's idea of the infinite is very materially based. It's almost kind of a proto-scientific way of thinking about the infinite. And this idea is rendered in one of his most famous passages, one that probably all of us are familiar with, from his poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he says, if the doors to perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. How will this come to pass? How will this opening of the eye to the infinite come to pass? By an improvement of sensual enjoyment. Blake is teaching us that we should see the world as closely and minutely and intricately as we possibly can. And only in doing this will we challenge those uniformities, those abstractions, those generalities that alienate us from the world. Do you remember an old documentary that you might have seen in physics class growing up called The Powers of 10? Right? It's really fabulous. I remember I saw it back in the 70s in school. Two filmmakers, Charles and Ray Eames, put it out in 1968. It was released in 1977. I remember sitting in my school classroom, those little clacking 16-millimeter projectors. We're all excited because we don't have to have lesson that day. We get to watch a film. It was this amazing, life-changing moment, right? So imagine a couple sitting in a park, say in Chicago, and the camera shows the couple from above. The camera goes in, magnifying itself to a power of 10. You get very close to the blanket on which they're sitting. The camera goes down into the earth, magnified to a power of 10. Down into the soil, down into the roots, down into the worms. The camera goes down into the dirt, magnified by the power of 10. You get down to molecules, you get down to cells. And eventually, when you get 10 to the power of 10, you're deep inside the atom. And what do you see? Huge spaces through which whirls of little particles dash and dart. Vroom! The camera pulls out, goes back to the couple, and then up into the sky, 10 to the power of 10. And you know what? When we get to the very outskirts of the galaxy, it looks almost the same as it does deep in the core of the atom, right? The particular, the minute, the close discrimination opens us into the infinite. I think this is what Emily Dickinson meant when she said, my business is circumference, right? You can endlessly circle around an object of perception. Each new point on the circle is a new place to stand. And you can do this over and over and over again, with each circle providing a new and fresh perspective. A constant undercutting of the general, a constant opening of the particular. William James, famous psychologist, late 19th, early 20th century, said, genius means little more than the faculty of perceiving in an unhabitual way. This is the William James who said, I want to reinstate the vague into our thinking about psychology. I'm tired of thinking about things. I want to know what it means to feel if, but, by, ifness, butness. Why can't these have a feeling just like the feeling of blue or hot, right? This is someone who's interested in what he called, well, he's interested in interest. And he says that interest comes from the Latin inter esse, to be between, right? So James is suggesting here that the way to really get at the very texture and fabric and motion of the world is not to rest on nouns, but to get into the kind of verbness of being. And this leads me to the second point I want to make. Poetry. It defamiliarizes our habitual senses of the world. It makes the world weird, right? Now, when I first came to Wake Forest, 1998, my chair at the time, the great Nancy Cotton, who is here with us today, I'm so happy to see her, asked me to come one Saturday to a recruiting fair, right? And I agreed. So I show up one October morning. I'm over in Ranolda Hall. I have my little English booth. There are prospective students from high schools all around North Carolina coming and trying to find out what it means to go to Wake Forest and what it might mean to major in biology, chemistry, whatever. So I'm a little worse for wear, I have to admit. One too many adult beverages the night before, right? So it's 9 a.m., I'm feeling a little haggard. And this kid comes up to me, and he's very bright, very bushy, very energetic, nice close cropped hairdo, freshly, crisply ironed shirt. And his dad looks exactly the same way, right? And he comes up to me and he says, sell me the English major. I was in no mood to market, right? So I just looked at him and I said, you know, man, English major, it'll just make you weird, right? I don't think he majored in English. He may not even come to Wake Forest. I hope Dr. Hatch isn't here, right? But I meant that in earnest in a way, right? Life is boring, let's face it. How many times have you walked to the end of your driveway? How many times have you eaten breakfast? How many times have you started your car? Their endless repetition makes life dull and boring. How can we shock ourselves into something new? Here's what Percy Shelley says poetry does. This is his essay, Defense of Poetry. He says, poetry awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. A man, to be greatly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. Some of us who have taken English classes know that a whole early literary critical movement of the 20th century, known as Russian formalism, said this is precisely what distinguishes literary language from non-literary language. It defamiliarizes our habitual relationship to language and the world. Roman Jakobson, one of the heroes of this movement, said, "Organized violence committed on ordinary speech." This is what literature can do. Another great literary critic and philosopher of the middle part of the 20th century, Gaston Bachelard, in his Poetics of Space, says the poetic image exists apart from causality. When the image is new, the world is new. So I'm constantly trying to emphasize to my students what metaphor can do, right? Metaphor, a powerful metaphor, will show us a striking relationship between two things that we have probably not thought of before. And this striking relationship, of course, always creates a third thing, that relationship between those two images. So a striking metaphor refreshes our sense of the world. I always tell the story of John Donne's great poem, The Flea, right? Where Donne's speaker is sitting on the bed trying to seduce a woman. She's a bit reticent. He looks down and he sees a flea. And he says, "Ah, that flea bit you. Your blood's inside that flea. That flea bit me. My blood's inside that flea. Our blood and our flesh are already mingled. We've already had sex. Let's do it again," right? You will never see a flea the same way again after hearing that poem. And we can think of all sorts of moments from poems we've read, from Ammons, from Keats, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Will you ever see a blade of grass the same way again? Eliot's Love Strong, a Grey Alfred Prufrock, where the yellowish London fog is likened to a patient etherized upon a table. You will never see the London fog the same way again. We are shocked into something fresh and new. And what do? When we are upset, when our abstractions are upheaved, we have to forge new ways to relate to this new world. We have to create our own metaphors. Poetry makes the world unfamiliar, and in doing so stokes our imaginations. Or so I tell my students, and I hope that I'm telling the truth, right? Emily Dickinson, well, we know her poem about the fly. I heard a fly buzz when I died, that blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz. Never see a fly the same way after that. Probably won't think of death the same way either. Dickinson has a poem, I think, that captures this idea of poetry as endlessly making the world weird and opening us to new possibilities for relating to that world. A famous poem. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. Poetry opens us to possibility. So I'm going to say that this is the third point I want to make about what poetry can do and hopefully does do. Poetry helps us to escape causality and liberates us into play. Whitman famously opens his 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, a poem now known as Song of Myself, by saying, "I celebrate myself. What I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass." What does it mean to loaf? I ask my students that. They think they know. They don't know what it means to loaf. We don't know what it means to loaf. Why do you relax? Why do you take a vacation? To fuel up for more work, or to recover from work that has come before. I think for me, in any case, and I suspect this is true of most of us, the idea of relaxing is causal. I'm relaxing now because I'm so damn tired from this week. I'm fueling up more energy because I've got a big Monday, right? This isn't loafing. This is being caught by time, living either retrospectively or prospectively. right? Loafing, I think, as Whitman means it, is a sudden foreclosing of causality. Those delicious moments when we become so immersed in what we're doing, sewing, reading, writing, playing tennis, jogging, playing guitar, that we think we've only been doing it 10 minutes. And we look up at the clock and 2 hours have passed. This is loafing. It's that sudden escape from the biting self-consciousness that usually keeps us from inhabiting the present moment. I tell my students when they're sitting there looking at me, they got that student look where they're performing interest. Right. I'm thinking, you're not thinking about what I'm saying, right? You're kind of you're looking behind you with nostalgia. Man, that was a good biscuit I had for breakfast. Or you're looking behind you with regret. Shouldn't have had that biscuit, right? Or they're looking ahead with anticipation. Can't wait to get out of this class. Or perhaps with anxiety. Got a test later. And I'm doing it right now. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how much more time do I have? And there's this constant kind of attenuation of the present to the past and the future. That is to be timed. That is to be tensed, right? And I think what Whitman means by loafing is simply to be in a moment where you're not tensed anymore. You're in the infinitive. You've not yet been conjugated, as it were, right? To be, not was, is, or will, right? This is what I think Blake means by being in eternity, not to be troubled by time. Right? And I think that poetry works very hard to do this because as Ammon says in his essay Poem as a Walk, it calls in the body as well as the mind, through rhyme, through rhythm, to music. To read a poem closely, to experience it intensely, is to have the whole body engaged. We're not often interested in meaning when we read a poem, at least not at first. We're interested in the experience of the poem. For my PhD exam, I had to read all of Ralph Waldo Emerson. My first book is on Emerson. And still, when I read an Emerson essay, I can't remember what the hell I've read. Right? It's almost like just sort of sliding through this wonderful language, and boom, he'll hit you with one of these really bizarre sentences. I'm a god in nature. I'm a weed by a wall. What? Right? I'm a transparent eyeball. What? But when I get to the end of it, I feel almost like, well, I've just listened to some music. Or I've just had a jog, right? It's almost as if that language, because of its density, its complexity, its viscerality, has for a little while saved me from making meaning. Meaning will come later, and it's important that it come later. But I think that the density, the complexity, and the merging of sound of sense of poetry can often help us for a brief time to escape the tyranny of meaning. There's a great line by the Zen poet Basho, how admirable he who looks at the flash of lightning and does not say life is transient. Right? All right, so I'm going to just say a few more words here about some ways that in my classroom I try as hard as I can to convey these qualities that I discern in poetry, these qualities that Ammon's constantly presents to me, and then I'll end with some Ammons. I was so pleased to have Professor Vindler here, so pleased to meet her for the first time. She's been a great tutelary spirit of my own teaching as well. Her book on Keats is absolutely essential to my understanding of Keats and the methods by which she reads poetry. That very nuanced, close, sensitive reading has utterly informed the way I try to read poems in my classrooms. I know that close reading is in some circles, considered somewhat old-fashioned, but to me, it is absolutely essential mode of teaching. I think the teaching of poetry, first and foremost, can slow us down. I know that's a bit of a cliche, but there's some validity to it. To spend a whole class on 4 Dickinson lines, you can do it. You can spend 3 classes on 4 Dickinson's lines. You know that poem, There's a Certain Slant of Light? It's endless. And it's true of many of our great poems. To really teach students how to get at that poem as that camera got at the ground in powers of 10. Right? Emerson says, under every deep and lower deep opens. Just the idea that the poem is a kind of little point at the top of a massive iceberg floating in the ocean, or a little node that opens us up into infinity. It's like the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. To give students that feeling, I think they find that much more interesting than twittering. It's so much more fun, right? So to spend a whole class on the Dickinson poem or a few lines of Amos has been very useful for me. It jars them. But you know what else? Poetry can speed us up too. And I think poems can move a hell of a lot faster than computers when we really get going. So I'd like to think about poems as sort of spinning the imagination, putting it in a kind of hyperdrive. When I try to get students to think metaphorically, analogically, make connections. How does this poem connect to your experience? How does it connect to that poet? How does it connect to that pop cultural event? It's quick. Because the leaps and the dives and the transitions of our best poets, Ammons, Whitman, you don't know what's going to come next, really can give us a sense of the joy of the mind moving very quickly over terrain, not caring too much about making meaning, having pleasure in merely circulating, as Stevens would say. I think it's fun to teach students to read against the grain. How wonderful to read someone like Shakespeare or Wordsworth and find blind spots, right? Now, I know this is one of the great banners of what used to be called deconstruction, and obviously it can be taken to an excess. But I think it was very liberating for me when I was in college to read Derrida. And suddenly realize, well, Shakespeare, he's so brilliant, but he's got blind spots too. It gives students a kind of sovereignty over the text. There's a space in the text where they can live and think and move, reading against the grain. But isn't it nice to read with the grain too? Isn't it nice to read a book by A.R. Ammons and try to get at what he's trying to do and take the pleasure of a great mind thinking about profoundly human problems and conditions? So I like allowing the poetry to teach. I like sometimes countering the deconstruction with the didactic. And I think ultimately the greatest poems do both at the same time. They deconstruct our familiar ways of being and teach us the great joy of doing that, how it attaches us to truth, beauty, and goodness. This is what I get from A.R. Ammons' A Poem is a Walk. This is what I get from my favorite Ammons poem, Corson's Inlet. That is this. The final lesson is, there are no final lessons. Let me conclude by reading the end of that poem. Corson's Inlet, last stanza. I see narrow orders, limited tightness, but will not run to that easy victory. Still around the looser, wider forces work. I will try to fasten into order enlarging grasps of disorder, widening scope, but enjoying the freedom that scope eludes my grasp, that there is no finality of vision, that I have perceived nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk.